This is where we take that huge stack of sources and research you send our way and we boil it all down. We give you the insights you need without the homework.
And today, we're tackling a big one, a framework that's, historical, revolutionary, and frankly, still incredibly controversial. The idea of class struggle.
It really is. It's arguably one of the most powerful ideas to come out of the 19th century. And for this deep dive, we've got a mountain material looking at Karl Marx's original concepts, the sharpest criticisms people have today in 2026, and maybe its surprising relevance.
Yeah, it's analytical power when you apply it to, say, the modern economy.
Exactly. So our mission is, well, it's straightforward, but it's deep. We need to unpack the original theory, that engine, then look at the 8 big critiques we found. And they range from, economic complexity to postmodern philosophy.
And then the big question.
The big question, does the fundamental idea of class conflict hold any weight at all in this dizzying world of global finance and the gig economy?
And I think we have to jump right in with the quote, the one statement that just perfectly sets the stage for everything else.
Do it.
The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. That's the declaration from Marx and Engels. And this conflict, they argued, gets simplified in our modern era. It just boils down to this inherent, irreconcilable fight.
The bourgeoisie versus the proletariat.
That's it. And for them, that's the engine of history.
Okay, but before we go any further, there's a really important piece of context we have to get out there. It's something our sources are, really strict about. We have tons of material on the theory, the history, the economic impact of these ideas, the what and the how. But we have, and I mean this, absolutely zero source information about Karl Marx as a person.
Nothing about him as a man or a child, his background.
Nothing. So we're kind of forced by the material to judge the theory and not the man behind it.
Which is fitting, in a way. I mean, the theory itself claims it's the objective economic forces that drive history, not, individual personalities.
That's a great point. Agreed. So let's start at the beginning. We need to define the terms. If we're going to critique this thing, we have to know what Marx actually meant by class.
Right. And to understand Marx's idea of class, you really have to just temporarily throw out all the modern ideas of, like, income brackets or what tax form you fill out.
So it's not about how much money you make.
Not primarily, no. It's defined by your structural relationship to the mode of production.
So where you stand in relation to the industrial engine of society.
Precisely. Marx had 2 sort of non-negotiable criteria. The first one is ownership of the means of production.
The land, the factories, the machinery.
Exactly. All of that.
Yeah.
And the second, which is just as important, is control of the labor power of others.
And that definition right there, it immediately sets up those 2 great hostile camps that the Communist Manifesto talks about. This is the heart of it all.
It is. So first, you have the bourgeoisie, the capitalists. They own the means of production, and, crucially, they profit by buying other people's ability to work. Their whole world revolves around accumulating capital, reinvesting, and, expanding.
And on the other side, the mirror image.
That would be the proletariat, the workers. And by definition, they own no means of production.
Yeah.
None at all. They're completely separated from the tools they would need to, create value on their own.
So to survive, they have no choice.
No choice. They're forced to sell the only thing they have, which is their ability to work their labor power in exchange for a wage. And that relationship, wage-labor, that's the absolute defining mechanism of capitalism.
What's so surprising, I think, for a lot of people hearing this is that Marx saw this as a systemic reality, a global one, not just, bad luck or someone failing as an individual.
Oh, absolutely. It's a relationship of structural dependency. The capitalist needs the worker to create what he called surplus value. That's the profit. And the worker needs the capitalist for a wage just to survive. The conflict is, it's baked right into the recipe.
I know our sources also mention a couple of transitional classes, and it's important we touch on them because they show the system wasn't, perfectly black and white even back then.
Correct. You have the petite bourgeoisie. This is a small sort of in-between class. They own some means of production, like a small shop or their own tools, but they don't buy the labor of others.
So the self-employed artisan or the person running a corner shop by themselves.
Exactly, the independent farmer. And Marx saw this group as being incredibly precarious. They're constantly fighting against the pressure from the big capitalists, always on the verge of going bankrupt and being, as he put it, hurled down into the proletariat.
So not a stable position to be in?
Not at all. And then you have the other category, the one Marx was, most dismissive of, the lumpenproletariat.
That translates to the dangerous class, right?
It does. Or, in the language of the source material, the social scum, that passively rotting mass. It's the bandits, beggars, the permanently dispossessed.
Wait, why was he so dismissive? I mean, on the surface, this seems like the most exploited group of all.
Because he didn't see them as a revolutionary force. In fact, he thought they were unstable, that they lacked class consciousness, and were just, easily manipulated.
Manipulated by who?
By the ruling class. The sources suggest he saw them as a potential bribed tool of reactionary intrigue. Basically, people who would disrupt a real workers' movement for some kind of short-term personal gain instead of fighting for systemic change.
That is a fascinating, if pretty cold analysis. It immediately makes you think about modern debates around poverty and, political mobilization. His framework doesn't put the most dispossessed at the front of the revolution, which is really counterintuitive.
Right, so once we have the classes defined, we need the engine that explains how this economic relationship shapes everything else in society. And that engine is historical materialism.
Okay, the base and superstructure model. Let's unpack that. This is the core philosophical claim that the economy dictates everything.
Pretty much. The economic base has two parts. The forces of production, so technology, resources, labor, and the relations of production. That's the property relations. Who owns what?
And that base, he argues, determines everything else. The superstructure.
Or at least profoundly conditions it. And yes, up in the superstructure you have, everything non-economic.
Culture, politics, religion, law, the media, all of it.
All of it. Now, sometimes people describe it as a two-way street. The superstructure can influence the base. But for Marx, the primary overwhelming direction of influence is from the material conditions, the base up to the social ideas and institutions.
So if the bourgeoisie controls the economic base, the factories, the capital, then it's basically inevitable that they'll try to control the superstructure to justify and maintain that control.
Precisely. They use the institutions, the legal system, schools, the church, media, to spread what Marx called false consciousness.
The ideological fog.
That's a good way to put it. It's the set of beliefs and assumptions that distract workers from the exploitation that's actually happening.
Okay, wait. Can you give us a concrete, modern example of that? Because false consciousness sounds very academic.
Sure. Think about all the messaging around personal responsibility in the economy. If there's a huge corporate layoff, false consciousness might lead workers to think, oh, I'm unemployed because I didn't have the right skills, or I didn't work hard enough.
Instead of thinking it's a systemic issue.
Exactly. Instead of seeing it as a predictable, cyclical part of capitalism's need to cut labor costs, the ideology shifts the blame from the system, the base, onto the individual who lives in the superstructure.
It's like the corporate PR that says we're all one big family right before they slash everyone's benefits. It's an attempt to paper over those opposing interests that Marx identified.
Perfectly put. By controlling the dominant story, they legitimize their own power and the inequalities that come from it.
And historical materialism sees all of history as a progression, right? A series of stages.
Yes. The source material lays out this progression of modes of production. You start with primitive communism, which has very few class differences, that collapses and moves into slavery, then to feudalism, where nobles control the land.
And each transition is a revolution driven by these internal problems, these contradictions.
Right, like the limits of feudal agriculture clashing with the new forces of, commerce and industry.
Which gives birth to capitalism, the system we're talking about today.
The most advanced and, in his view, the most unstable system yet. Marx believed his own internal contradictions would eventually lead to a revolution, first into socialism, and then finally to a classless, stateless, moneyless, communist society.
It's a very powerful, very deterministic view of history.
It is. And if the base superstructure model explains the politics, the concept of alienation explains the psychological cost of capitalism for the individual worker. It's about being estranged from your own human experience.
This is so critical because it takes the argument beyond just my paycheck is too small. It's about a deep structural wound inflicted by the work itself. So what are the four dimensions he identified?
The first is alienation from the product of their labor. Imagine someone on an assembly line. They spend all day making one tiny component for a car.
But they don't own the car. They can't decide its price, and they probably can't even afford to buy one.
Exactly. The product they help create is immediately owned by the capitalist. It becomes this alien thing that stands against them. In fact, the more they produce, the richer the capitalist gets, which just reinforces their own powerlessness.
Okay, that's one. What's the second dimension?
The second is alienation from the labor process itself. This is about the conditions of work.
So the lack of control.
Complete lack of control. Under capitalism, the work process is external to the worker. They don't control the pace, the purpose, the method. The capitalist dictates everything to maximize profit. So the work becomes repetitive, monotonous, exhausting.
He has that line about how the worker only feels at home when he's not working.
Yes. And when they are working, they do not feel at home. Their work is involuntary. It's just a means to an end.
That feels incredibly relevant. I mean, it's not just about a 19th century factory floor. You see that kind of hyper-managed efficiency in, Amazon fulfillment centers or even some corporate offices today.
It connects powerfully, which is why the idea has stuck around. Now, the third dimension is the really philosophical one, alienation from their potential self, or what he called their species being.
Species being. Can you explain that?
Marx argued that what makes us human is our ability for conscious, creative, free activity. We can imagine something and then create it. We transform the world according to a plan.
But when work is just about survival?
When it's just a repetitive task designed to make money for someone else, it crushes that creativity. It estranges the worker from their own human essence, their potential to be a creative being.
Wow, that's a heavy claim. It's not just my job is boring, it's the system is preventing me from being fully human.
That's the deepest level of estrangement. And the final dimension brings it all back to the social structure, alienation from other workers.
Now, that seems odd. Why would working next to hundreds of other people alienate you from them?
Because the system forces them to compete. Workers are pitted against each other for a promotion, for a better shift, or just to avoid being the one who gets laid off.
Right. The hierarchy, the performance reviews, all of it.
It's all designed to maximize profit. And a side effect is that it breaks down any sense of community or solidarity. They become rivals instead of allies, which just isolates them even more within the system.
So if alienation is the psychological cost, how does that translate into action?
Yeah.
Into history? This is where we move from the philosophy to the actual revolutionary dynamic.
Right. Because for Marx, conflict is the engine of history. The class interests are just fundamentally opposed. You can't get around it. The capitalist wants to maximize profit, which means keeping labor costs low. The worker wants to maximize wages and benefits, which cuts into profit.
It's a zero-sum game in a way.
In that framework, yes. The system can't resolve this contradiction. One side ultimately has to win.
So how does that escalate? How do you get from, say, one strike at one factory to a full-blown societal revolution?
It's a process. As capitalism develops, a few things happen. The working conditions for the proletariat become more and more similar. They get concentrated in big industrial cities. They're all facing the same pressures.
So they start to see their shared problems.
Exactly. This shared objective condition leads, eventually, to the development of class consciousness.
The big aha moment, the realization of shared interests.
Yes. When workers finally recognize their common enemy, their common fate, and their power to act together, they transform. They go from being a passive class in itself, it's a group of people with the same economic status, to a revolutionary class for itself.
A shift from an objective category to a subjective political force.
That's the key. The goal then becomes the political takeover of the state, the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, and the creation of a transitional socialist state, what he called the dictatorship of the proletariat.
And the ultimate goal, way down the line, is that classless communist society.
Right. A society where private property is abolished, and the whole system is focused on human need, not profit. It's defined by that principle that the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all.
A total reversal of alienation.
That's the vision.
What I find so fascinating about Marx's analysis is that he doesn't just paint the bourgeoisie as these one-dimensional villains. He actually gives them credit for being, well, an incredibly revolutionary force in history.
Oh, absolutely. He saw them as playing a necessary world-changing role. He said the bourgeoisie pitilessly torn us under the motley feudal ties that bound people to their, natural superiors.
They got rid of all the old traditions and loyalties.
All of it. All the sentimentality, the religious justifications, they left behind nothing but naked self-interest and callous cash payment. They were the ultimate disruptors.
They really were.
They showed what humanity was capable of. They created a global market, built wonders that, he said, surpassed the pyramids or Roman aqueducts. They were necessary to sweep away that old, inefficient feudal world.
But their greatest strength, this constant need to innovate, is also their fatal flaw. They can't exist without constantly revolutionizing the means of production.
And that creates this permanent instability, this constant drive for new markets, new tech. It leads to what he called an uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions. It creates everlasting uncertainty and agitation.
It's a system that can never, ever stand still.
Never. And this is where Engels came up with that incredible line that all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned.
That phrase, all that is solid melts into air, it feels like a perfect description of the kind of rapid disruptive change we see today with globalization and technology.
It's the system's DNA. And by forcing all nations to adopt its methods, the bourgeoisie creates a world after its own image. But this very same drive, this genius for production, creates the contradiction that dooms them.
The commercial crises.
Yes. And the weird thing is, these crises aren't caused by failure. They're caused by overwhelming success.
By producing too much.
Exactly. Capitalism creates such gigantic productive forces that the system can't handle it. It becomes unstable because it produces too much. He called it the epidemic of overproduction.
Society is thrown into chaos not because there's a famine, but because there's too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry.
The very sources of wealth become a problem because no one can profitably buy all the stuff being made. And the system's only solution is to destroy products, shut down factories, and lay off workers, the very people who need the things being produced.
Which leads to the final famous conclusion.
The bourgeoisie produces its own gravediggers, the proletariat. The same weapons they used to destroy feudalism, globalization, industrialization are now turned against them. For Marx, their fall and the victory of the workers were, well, equally inevitable.
Okay, so that gives us a really clear, powerful, deterministic framework. But now we have to bring it into the modern day where, let's be honest, traditional Marxism faces some huge challenges. We've pulled together 5 major critiques from our sources.
Right.
Let's start with the one that goes right for the foundation. The idea that the two-class structure is just too simple.
This is a big one. Marx predicted this clear polarization, right?
Yep.
A tiny, super-rich bourgeoisie and then a vast, impoverished proletariat. But the sources argue that in modern Western countries especially, that model is just. It's sociologically outdated. It doesn't capture the complexity of real life.
Why not? I mean, I'm still a wage laborer. I sell my time for money. Why is that line so blurry now?
It's blurry because so many wage laborers now have a kind of dual relationship to capital. First, think about asset ownership, the stock market.
Pensions, 401k.
Exactly. Even if the vast majority of wealth is still concentrated at the very top, many workers are participating in capital through their retirement funds or owning a few shares. They're selling their labor, yes, but they're also benefiting, even in a small way, from the means of production.
So they become these little petit capitalists on the side.
In a way, yes. And an even bigger factor is homeownership. Our sources point out that in a country like Britain, about 70% of people own their homes. And they don't just see it as a place to live, they see it as an economic asset.
Something that will grow in value, something they can borrow against.
Precisely, which means a huge chunk of the working population has a real vested interest in the stability of asset markets. It really complicates the clean line between owner and non-owner.
And there's actual data to back this up, right? The sociological picture is much messier.
It is. The sources talk a lot about the Great British Class Survey from 2011, and it provided really compelling evidence against the simple two-class model. Instead of 2 classes, it identified 7 distinct social classes.
7. How on earth did they define them?
They went way beyond just economics. They argued that cultural capital, your tastes, your interests, what you do for leisure and social capital, your networks, your connections, were almost as important as money in determining your social position.
So it's not just what you own, but who you know and what you know.
Exactly. The survey found groups like the technical middle class or the new affluent workers. And while they did find an ordinary elite class, it was only about 6% of the population. It shows that while wealth is still concentrated, the vast majority of people are in this much more stratified, complex middle ground, which really undermines the idea of a single, unified proletariat.
Okay, so that's the first critique. The second one argues that even if exploitation still exists, the brutal system Marx saw in the 1800s has been fundamentally tamed.
Right. This argument rests on 2 big historical shifts. The first is that the capitalists themselves got smarter. The sources bring up Henry Ford in the early 20th century.
The $5 workday.
The $5 workday. Ford realized that if he paid his workers a really high wage, they could afford to buy the cars they were building.
So high wages create consumer demand. It feeds back into the system.
It does. And this created mass consumerism, which meant workers were less purely exploited, and crucially, they started to buy into the system. They became consumers, homeowners, stakeholders. It integrated them rather than just alienating them.
But the even bigger change came from the government, right? The move away from pure free market capitalism.
That's the key. The shift to Keynesian economics and the creation of the welfare state, especially in Western Europe after World War II. The state started to regulate capitalism, to tax profits, and to soften the harsh edges of pure competition.
And how does the welfare state directly counter Marx's predictions?
It provides a safety net. Things like universal health care, state pensions, public education, Social Security, all funded by progressive taxes. They act like a collective insurance policy. It removes that existential dread, that constant insecurity that drove the 19th century worker to the brink.
And of course, the most direct counter to raw exploitation would be the minimum wage.
Yes. Our sources mention the UK minimum wage in 2023 being over £10 an hour. That's a legal floor. It's the state saying there's a limit to how low the price of labor can fall. It's a structural barrier against the kind of extreme exploitation Marx was analyzing when wages were just subject to raw supply and demand.
So the argument is that the system has just evolved to be, well, a lot less brutal.
Right. The long-term trend, critics say, has been one of growing general prosperity.
Okay, critique number 3. If the material conditions are better, what about the psychological ones? This one argues that work today is just a lot less alienating.
The idea here is that the job market itself has changed so dramatically. We've moved from, a blue-collar factory economy to a white-collar, technical and service-based one.
And those jobs are different.
Very different. The sources show that in the UK, something like 45% of jobs are in skilled or technical fields. These jobs just inherently give workers more autonomy, more complexity, more mental engagement than tightening the same bolt on an assembly line for 12 hours.
So more control over the labor process.
Exactly. And on top of that, you have the huge rise of self-employment. Over 4 million people in the UK. These are people who, by definition, control their own hours, their own methods, their own terms.
They're the modern petite bourgeoisie, and they're definitely not alienated in the same way because they control the whole process.
Correct. They have autonomy. And even for employees, we're seeing trends like working from home, flexible hours. Critics say this shows companies flexing around the needs of workers, which is a total reversal of the old dynamic where the factory clock dictated every second of your life.
So the combination of unions, better management, and the professionalization of work has given a lot of control back to the worker.
That's the argument, that capitalism has proven to be way more adaptable and able to satisfy people's needs than Marx ever gave it credit for.
All right, critique 4. This one hits at the very core of historical materialism. That idea that the economic base controls the cultural and political superstructure.
Critics here argue that the superstructure today has what they call relative autonomy. The state, the media, the legal system, they're just too big and complex to be simple puppets of the ruling class anymore.
And you can see that, right? If you just look at how messy modern society is, how do the sources back that up?
Well, look at the media. Yes, you have huge corporate media giants. But the sources also point to the explosion of independent online media, blogs, social media, citizen journalists who are often incredibly critical of governments, corporations, and the global elite.
They operate outside the control of the traditional gatekeepers.
Totally. And look at culture itself. So many of our most popular artists, musicians, filmmakers are openly critical of the system. If the bourgeoisie had absolute control of the superstructure, would that kind of mainstream critique even be possible?
It's a good question. So if the superstructure isn't just a puppet, then that whole idea of false consciousness starts to fall apart.
It does. And then you have the philosophical objection, which comes from postmodernism.
Why do postmodernists reject this so strongly?
Because the very idea of false consciousness implies that there is a single objective, correct consciousness. One truth that the workers need to wake up and see. And postmodernism rejects the idea of a single universal truth.
For them, reality is fragmented, it's subjective, there are many truths.
Exactly. They would look at Marxism and call it a meta-narrative, a big, grand story that tries to explain all of history and destiny with one single theory. They say those grand narratives are obsolete. We should focus on smaller, localized struggles around identity, gender, community, not on trying to create one perfect classless society based on one economic truth.
Okay, and that brings us to the fifth and final critique, which is maybe the most direct and brutal of all, the historical record, the failures of actual communist states.
This is the empirical test, right? And the sources are pretty blunt. The communist revolutions in Eastern Europe, Russia, and elsewhere, they did not lead to the freedom and equality Marx predicted.
Instead, they mostly led to authoritarianism.
Authoritarian state control, human rights abuses, massive economic problems. They just failed to deliver on either the prosperity or the liberation that was promised.
And the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 is the ultimate symbol of that failure.
It is. Followed by the rush of all those former Soviet bloc countries towards market economies, critics point to this history and basically say, look, the theory was tested in the real world and it failed. What other alternative is there?
Although, to be fair, we have to mention the counter-argument from modern Marxists.
We do. They would argue that the state communism of the 20th century was never real communism. It was a distorted, totalitarian state capitalism that had nothing to do with the classless, stateless society Marx and Engels actually wrote about.
And that distinction is really the key intellectual space where the theory can still survive despite the historical record.
It is. It allows them to separate the original theory from its failed applications.
Okay, so we have these 5 really powerful critiques. But despite all of that, our sources argue that Marx's framework is still an incredibly potent tool for analyzing some of the biggest problems we face today. It's like it provides the grammar, even if the dictionary has changed.
Exactly. The core ideas, exploitation, class division, alienation, they give us a unique lens to understand things, especially when you zoom out and look at the global picture. What's so fascinating is that Marx's prediction of polarization, which didn't really happen at the national level because of the rise of the middle class, has become scarily accurate on a global level.
The gap between the global rich and the global poor isn't closing.
It's accelerating dramatically. The sources cite figures showing the top 1% now control more wealth than the bottom 50% of the entire world's population. That is a stark transnational class division that looks exactly like what Marx was talking about.
And the digital economy has created these new forms of work, the gig economy, that feel like a 21st century reboot of the 19th century alienated worker.
The gig economy is a perfect modern example. It's exploitation and alienation, but it's been rebranded as flexibility and being your own boss.
Right. Companies like Uber or Amazon Flex.
They extract value through these short-term contracts. The workers are technically independent contractors, which means the company gets to avoid paying for benefits, job security, or even guaranteeing a minimum wage.
So how does this link back to those 4 types of alienation?
It hits every single one. First, alienation from the product. The driver provides the ride, but the real value, the data, the platform, the fees, is owned by a huge transnational corporation. Second, alienation from the labor process. They might choose their hours, but the algorithm controls the price, the route, the pace. They have zero control over the actual terms of their work.
And the work itself is often just stressful transactional labor.
Which is alienation from their species being. It's not creative, purposeful work. And finally, alienation from other workers. Because they're all competing against each other for gigs, being rated by an algorithm, and they're never in the same physical space, it's incredibly hard to organize or build solidarity.
They're technologically isolated and pitted against one another. It's like a return to the precariousness of labor before all the 20th century regulations and protections were put in place.
It's capital using technology, the new means of production, to find a loophole around all those protections.
And if we zoom out again globally, the theory is still really useful for explaining why some countries stay rich and others stay poor.
This is where you get dependency theory. It builds right on Marx's ideas about imperialism. It argues that resource extraction, unequal trade deals, and debt basically keep the developing world, the global south, economically subservient to the wealthy nations of the global north.
So it's a global class system where you have a periphery of nations providing cheap labor and raw materials.
And a core of nations that own the high-value technology and financial capital. Dependency theorists would say the whole structure of global capitalism is designed to actively prevent the global south from developing independently, which just locks in that pattern of exploitation.
A really profound and necessary modern adaptation of Marxism is eco-socialism. This connects the class struggle directly to the environmental crisis we're facing.
And the argument is devastatingly simple. The root cause of climate change, deforestation, biodiversity loss, It isn't just human nature. It's the capitalist system's absolute requirement for the relentless, infinite pursuit of profit.
The system has to grow forever on a planet with finite resources.
That's the core contradiction. Marx's original critique of how capitalism overexploits both human labor and natural resources fits perfectly with today's ecological debates. For a capitalist, nature is just a free input to be consumed and a free dumping ground for waste. The long-term costs are just pushed onto society and the planet.
So critics of so-called green capitalism would say you can't just tweak the market to fix this.
They'd argue that market solutions, like putting a price on carbon, are just not enough because they don't change the underlying drive for limitless growth. An eco-socialist would say the only way to achieve real sustainability is to transform the underlying economic system itself.
It's a radical framework suggesting that ecological destruction and social inequality are just two sides of the same coin.
The same profit-driven mechanism.
You know, even when we're using this Marxist lens, it's important to compare it to other classic perspectives. Max Weber offered a really crucial, more complex view of all this.
He did. Weber gave us a much more nuanced, multi-dimensional way to look at social hierarchy. He argued that you can't explain everything with economics alone. He thought you needed three distinct dimensions.
Okay, let's walk through those three.
First, he agreed with Marx on class, but he defined it more narrowly as just your economic position, your market situation.
So your job, your skills, your economic value.
Right. Second, he added status. This is about social honor, prestige, lifestyle. It's often based on cultural tastes or social groups, and it can be separate from just raw wealth.
So you could be a respected but poor academic with high status, or a billionaire with very low social status among certain groups. They don't always align.
Exactly. And the third dimension is party. This is about political power, influence, being part of powerful organizations. Again, this can be separate from your wealth or your social honor.
So a politician might have immense power from their party, even if their personal class is modest. Weber's model basically shows that inequality is this complex web of economic, social, and political power.
It really challenges Marx's economic determinism. It suggests that culture and politics can drive change too, not just reflect the economic base.
This is where we get to put this whole ideological conflict into the language of math. The economist Richard Goodwin created a model in the 60s to capture Marx's boom and bust cycles.
He did. He wanted to formalize that idea of capitalism's internal instability, specifically the relationship between unemployment and wages. And he used the Lotka-Volterra predator-prey equations.
Which are from biology, right? Like modeling populations of wolves and deer.
Exactly. It's a surprising analogy for economics. But in his model, the predator and prey are not classes, but two key variables: the worker's share of income and the employment rate.
And how do they prey on each other?
They cycle out of phase. So you start in a boom, the employment rate is high. After a bit, workers get more bargaining power and demand higher wages. The worker's share of income goes up.
And as the worker's share goes up, the capitalist's profit share has to go down.
Right. And when profits get squeezed, capitalists cut back. They stop investing, they lay people off, so then the employment rate starts to fall.
And with rising unemployment, workers lose their bargaining power.
Their wages fall, which restores the capitalist's profitability. And once profits are back up, they start hiring again, and the whole cycle starts over. It's a self-perpetuating loop driven entirely by that antagonistic relationship.
It's Marx's theory of crisis written in differential equations.
Yeah.
And we have real-world data testing this model, right? From Brazil between 1981 and 2009.
We do. And the data showed a really compelling qualitative agreement. The variables did cycle out of phase, just like the model predicted. It supported the basic Marxian idea that these short-term economic cycles are driven by this conflict.
So the conflict mechanism is real, but this is where we get to the critical flaw, the point where the data broke the model's prediction.
This is the key finding. The math of the Goodwin model predicts that all these cycles should revolve around a single, fixed, stable center point. The system should always return to this one equilibrium.
And the data from Brazil showed.
It showed the absence of that single fixed center. The center of the cycle clearly moved after 1994, which was when Brazil had this massive economic shift that ended its hyperinflation. The cycles weren't orbiting a fixed star, they were orbiting a point that was itself moving over time.
Which suggests the fundamental rules of the economic system itself had changed.
Exactly. The flaw shows that the parameters Goodwin treated as constants, things like how fast wages rise or how quickly companies lay people off, are actually time-dependent variables. The economic ecosystem isn't a closed loop. It's constantly evolving and changing its own rules.
So it's empirical proof for the existence of the conflict, but at the same time, it's a mathematical refutation of the strict, fixed determinism of the classical theory.
That's a perfect summary. This deep dive really shows that Marx's original vision, that simple two-class society leading to an inevitable revolution is, well, it's scientifically and historically unsound for most modern economies.
But, and this is a huge but, his analytical framework, that grammar for understanding exploitation, structural inequality, and capitalism's own destabilizing drive for growth, that remains incredibly relevant. The details have changed, but the core tension between capital and human dignity is still a critical friction point today.
And that tension brings us to our final thought. Friedrich Engels once looked back at the transition from the feudal to the capitalist world, and he pointed to the figure of Dante. He said Dante was both the last poet of the Middle Ages and the first poet of modern times.
A figure who stood on the bridge between two entire historical epochs.
He captured the chaos of one system dying and the next one being born. So the question for us is, if we are standing on the precipice of a new era today, one defined by digital capital, the gig economy, global inequality, and the ecological crisis, will we see a new figure, a new framework emerge to mark the birth of this new, maybe post-capitalist era?
Or will we just keep grappling with the same fundamental contradictions that Marx was the first to lay bare almost 2 centuries ago? A profound question. And for you, the learner, think about how these ideas of economic power intersect with modern identity politics in your own world. Is the struggle for liberation still just about material conditions, or are the two now so intertwined that they're creating new revolutionary forces that defy Marx's original map? We'll leave you with that to explore on your own.